As the race to the presidential election heats up, significant changes could be coming to our electoral system after the votes are recorded. The upcoming 2020 census is expected to shift the number of House seats across the country. An analysis from Cleveland.com projects 9 states are set to lose seats and 7 are expected to make gains.
It's important to know that none of the changes will impact the November general election. Rich Exner is behind the new projections, and he joins us now from Cleveland, Ohio. He is a data analyst editor for Cleveland.com. So, I remember when we were talking about the census and the implications and trying to teach people why, adding a census question is really, really important, the long-term impact. So here we are looking at the numbers. Rich, first of all, what stood out to you the most when you took a look at the numbers?
Just at a glance, you see that the giant loss of seats in the Midwest, Great Lakes states, or the East, and heading south, just like we would guess on the population. We know people have been moving to those warm weather places for some time, but it really shows up when you take a look at reshuffling how the House of Representatives is divided up.
Oh, that's interesting.
So how was the analysis conducted?
Well, the Census Bureau every year puts out population estimates, but only the real census every 10 years counts for Congress. So they came out with new estimates for 2019, at the end of December, and that estimate is for basically July of 19. The census will take place in April of 2020, April of this year. So I projected forward if the changes that the census says has happened continue through next April, where will the population for each state be? And also, you have to figure in the people that are assigned overseas. This is a little different when you're only when you're talking about how many Congress members each state gets. But if you have people that are assigned overseas for the military or other federal purposes, they still count in their home state, and you got to work that in there. And then you got 435 seats in Congress. Every state gets at least one, and then you divide up the rest of them.
All right, so let's look at some of these states. We'll start with Ohio, slated to lose 1 seat. The Buckeye State has been losing House seats. So what does this tell us about Ohio in a broader sense?
Ohio's population has been very slow in growth. It hasn't been shrinking, but slow in growth, while the rest of the country is gaining a lot more people. So every time you don't keep up with the rest of the country in population growth, you stand to lose influence in Congress.
For the most part, Northeast and Midwestern states are losing seats. Meanwhile, the South and the West are slated to mostly make gains. So what does this shift tell us?
It's going to be interesting. I think Texas is going to be really interesting politically and on this next year, because they're the one state, if the projections hold, they would pick up 3 seats. And lately, at least for last 10 or 20 years, it's been a pretty red state, Republican. But I know that the Democrats hope to turn it into what they call a purple state, one that could go either way. So adding 3 seats to Texas doesn't necessarily mean more Republican influence, depending on which state that goes, or which way that state goes politically. But that's going to be a real interesting one to watch. And for as long as I can remember, on presidential elections, it had come down to Ohio and Florida. Some question whether Ohio will be in that mix this year or not, but Florida is slated to gain 2 more seats. So that'll be an even more important state going forward in presidential elections.
Yeah, when you mentioned the shifts south and we saw the map, I saw Florida and I was like, yeah, I totally get that. Texas actually does sort of surprise me. I don't recall hearing about a lot of people sort of moving to Texas. Right. And I also thought, the thing I thought about Texas and its population is often, when we're having discussions about particularly laws being changed, it's Texas versus California, right? These are the big population states. And California looks like it's going to lose at least 1 seat.
That one surprised me a little bit, too. I think it's a product of it being so big as it was already, that if it didn't keep up that drastic growth that it had seen, there's still going to be, I think there'll be more. I don't have that number in front of me right now, but I think that they'll still have more congressional seats than any other state. But they were so large, if they didn't continue the growth like they had been, I guess that's where they stand to lose 1. In fact, I did this with the help of a great tool that the Population Studies Center up at the University of Michigan put together, that you can basically plug in any number and you can see how close each state is to gaining or losing another seat. Let me just check my paper real quick. California is 360,000 people away on the projection from keeping that seat without losing it. And 360,000 is a lot of people, but in California, we're talking 40 million people almost. Oh. So if it's off a little bit 360,000 in a state of almost 40 million people. That could be enough to hang on to it. And that's where you get into, they're spending one heck of a lot of money in California, probably more than any other state, to get out the count, so to speak, to make sure everyone is counted, and to get into communities that maybe don't speak English as much or are more transient if they're farm workers on the move and so forth. They're spending a lot of money in California, and I'm sure that's a big reason behind it, to try to make sure that they keep their count as high as possible, or as accurate as possible, I guess they would say.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the Texas numbers as well, because I have friends, a lot of friends in Texas, and I've watched some of the suburbs around Dallas grow immensely. I mean, I have a buddy of mine who moved to Frisco, Texas, maybe 15, 20 years ago, and there were just a couple of thousand people living there in that neighborhood, just a couple of miles outside of Dallas. Now it's huge. It's
really?
Yeah, it's a very, very big suburb of that city. And so the question I would have, I guess, Rich, is when you look at the numbers specifically when it comes to Texas, are you seeing the growth of the population from people within the state, or are there people moving, like my buddy did, from New York to Texas?
I think it's people moving from outside. Every year when the projections come out or the estimates come out, the counties around Dallas are all among the fastest growing counties in the United States. And then we keep hearing more and more lately about Austin. And when we're talking about Austin, you got the University of Texas there, but really it's a lot of that tech, I think like Apple and a lot of the high tech companies are moving in there. So that's where a little bit of maybe California is moving into Texas too. So it's a little different makeup. Just because a state's growing, if the people are coming from somewhere else, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to become. If a state is historically Republican, it might be Democrats being introduced to a state too.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is.
Rich Exner, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.